Hello and welcome back to Bitcoin with Jake. Today I'm speaking with Fractal Encrypt. Welcome, sir.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jake.
No, my absolute pleasure. I can't wait to find out the backstory on the work you've been doing in the space. So we'll get into that in time. The way I kick things off is always very similar. So we've all ended up in the Bitcoin ecosystem, but every journey that we took to get here is different. So I'd love to hear how you first came across Bitcoin and what the kind of the journey was like for you.
Oh, sure, no problem. Always happy to talk about Bitcoin. And how I first encountered it is certainly part of the journey, I would say. I guess for all of us, that's um, part of the journey. And really, there was multiple times I came into contact with Bitcoin. I used to do moderation on a psychedelic mushroom forum and the news forum. I was one of the moderators, and we came across Bitcoin. And I think the Gawker article was the first time I really recognized it. But Silk Road was actually advertised on that website in the forum, so people were definitely aware of Silk Road and Bitcoin extremely early on. I think that was actually the first place it was ever advertised on. So I kind of thought it was like sketchy and weird, and like, why are these people ordering stuff over the internet from people they don't know? And I had zero concept of Bitcoin as anything at all other than just PayPal, or like, it didn't seem like anything to me at all. But I do remember seeing an article where it said the price crashed from $70 to $7, and it was some horrible thing. But I didn't really understand that it had a price, or that the price moved in relative to US dollar or anything like that. So to me, that stuff was kind of peripheral to the fact that people were now being able to access, like, there was like this weird libertarian market where you could access, like, anything you wanted, as long as you could, willing to pay for it and take the risks and stuff. So I thought that part of the experiment was very interesting, but I didn't realize, like, the economic experiment that was going on as well. So I definitely had a couple touch points there. We saw the whole Silk Road thing go up and then down. And so I watched all that happen from the sidelines and was definitely familiar with hearing about Bitcoin. And I had even found an article which I've searched for a couple of times. It wasn't truly an article. It was actually a long forum post that one of the members had put up. And it described how to get Bitcoin at the time. And it involved, kind of putting on a hoodie and going to the specific ATM in New York City or wherever it was. And like, you had to like send money to Japan and then just kind of like hope that you'd be able to get Bitcoin sent to you in like 2 weeks or something. And it just seemed like, to me, not very safe, or very, like, it just seemed totally Wild Westy to me. And so a lot of that just put me off, and I just wasn't really like interested in going down that route, because I didn't really have anything drawing me very deep into it. But I was at least interested enough to just keep, kind of poking around. And then at some point in 2015, I've always sold art. Well, not always, but I've been selling art like at Grateful Dead shows and music festivals for a long time, probably since the early 2000s. And at some point, some guy asked me from Brazil if I would sell him some of my art for Bitcoin, because it was just the easiest way to do an international transaction for him. And I had heard of Bitcoin for many years, so I was just like, sure, I'll take it, but you just have to tell me how to accept this stuff. And he walked me through the whole thing, got me my wallet, got me set up, sent me the Bitcoin. I sent him the art. And I actually, like, then he told me, like, oh, here's how you can see, I guess, what the value of it was. And I didn't really notice that the value changed. It was just whatever it was when I looked at it the moment I opened that website. And it was some website called Preve.com, and all it showed was just the Bitcoin price, and there was like nothing else at all on the site other than a moving digit. And I think the price at that time was like a couple $100, like a little over $200 or something. And so at that point, I got the Bitcoin, and then I just didn't really think about it. I just forgot about it. And then at some point, a friend needed some Bitcoin. He wanted to do what everybody was doing at the time. And so he said, hey, do you know where I can get some Bitcoin? I said, oh, sure. I actually have 3 of those, and like, I need to pay my rent right now. So like, I think I got like $1,800 for the 3 Bitcoin that I had earned there. But like, the thing was, like, the art that I sold the guy was only like $400. So like, I had actually made this huge increase in income.
Wow.
But even that, like, didn't fully register in my mind that like it had gone through this relatively large increase in price. Like, it kind of registered, but it still didn't click enough to get the gears rolling. So again, it's just like, okay, you have this thing, it comes and goes and disappears. And then I guess what it was I had 3.1 Bitcoin and I had given my friend 3 Bitcoin. And then that same friend calls me like 2 years later and he's like, hey, you remember that $10 a Bitcoin you didn't want to sell me, a couple of years ago? Like, you need to check your account because Bitcoin's worth $4,000. And I was like, no, it's not, man. Like, like, why are you messing with me? And I was in the car driving home. Like, I get home, I look and I was like, wow, that like $10 turned into $400. And that was like September 2017 or something. So like now I was like, okay, now I'm paying attention. Like, what in the fuck just happened here? Like, how did this $400 art sale that I made back all this time ago, now I have my $400 back again? Like, it just keeps reappearing. Like, there's something going on here. So then I started actually like paying attention, but I got all messed up into kind of like falling for shitcoinery and all kinds of weird, like, oh, Bitcoin is old, slow technology. You want these new cool things that like let you roller skate on the moon or whatever it is, like dental coin. And I didn't actually fall for dental coin, but I probably would have. I wasn't that smart. And not that I'm much better now, but at least know to stick away from shitcoinery. But at the time, it was like one of those lessons I had to go through and learn. But it was really like one of those things that it was just like I kept kind of getting hit in the head with it, but not paying attention. And at some point, it was just like, hey, there's something going on here. And I think as soon as I actually got it, that's when like my mind kind of started churning. And I said, okay, this is actually like some interesting stuff. And I actually started kind of changing the art that I was doing to incorporate Bitcoin. And I tend to be like very subject oriented. So for many years, like all those years from like 2000 to maybe this early, like late 2017 time, I had done art of kind of like a psychedelic nature, because I use the art to kind of spread a message, I suppose, is what I tend to do. And so now it was like I had incorporated this new revolutionary technology into the message. And so that was kind of a huge step for me. And then I followed that path for a while, and it went into all kinds of weird places. Like, people were telling me Ethereum was going to be the future of art and NFTs are awesome and all this. So I fell for all that and spent a little while going down those rabbit holes, which, I think all that was valuable to me. I think like I have to learn lessons the hard way sometimes. And that was certainly a good way to experience the pain of shitcoining, was to like go through that like late 2017, early 2018 market. So I think I learned a lot there. That was really kind of how I got into it. And it took me a good while, even after I kind of got my feet kind of planted in like, hey, this is like a very interesting crypto revolution, to actually coming across the, hey, this is actually like a Bitcoin revolution, and there's a bunch of hangers on that are called crypto and shitcoins. And like, so I think that was kind of like July 2019 where I really started to get my feet firmly planted in Bitcoin as a thing. And the more deeper I look into it, the more reinforcing it does. So I definitely interested in the path that's both ahead of me and looking back to where we came from.
Brilliant.
Hopefully that answered that.
No, and there's so many things for me to draw from as well, which I love. A very organic process is how I would summarize that. And I've got lots of shared experiences in a sense, and getting caught up with shit coins. And, I took my Bitcoin Cash, instead of just buying more Bitcoin, I bought a classic car that was 40 years old that I sold 3 months later because it fucking never worked, broke down like the first night I bought it. I didn't understand how important Bitcoin was at all. But it's only through being burnt from a number of different occasions, going on holidays and, spending your gains. Like that summer of 2017, everyone's banging on about the block size wars. And I was like, I've made great gains from 2015, much like yourself had. You're stupid not to take some profit. And I did. I just took some money out and spent it on whatever the fuck I wanted to spend it on. Do you know what I mean? You just didn't.
Absolutely.
It takes those experiences to, first of all, it's still alive. Like in 2017, it's like, it's probably going to disappear. Like, fuck it, whatever. It suddenly comes along 2020 and, stock listed companies are buying this stuff. You're like, wow, this is crazy. And that's what really caught my attention, was when more kind of traditional regulated markets started buying. It's like, okay, that really caught my attention from a
I think that's something I've heard a lot too, where people that were in very early, like they had a similar progression where it's like, you even though you're there and things are happening, you just don't understand what you're in contact with. And I think that's true for a lot of people. So now I tend to have a very hard line on what it is. And my wife says, oh man, you're like, the best hodler, because it's like, we went through all these markets, and it's like, I'm not selling, like, this is like, no. And it's like, she's like, I got to tell, my sisters to do what you're doing, because like that, nobody thinks like that. And I'm like, well, I didn't just begin thinking like this. It's like, because I had
Took
something
5
and I like
years.
foolishly lost
Yeah.
it, and then saw what it was actually worth later, that now I'm like thinking things through a lot more. And like, no.
Yeah. And that's why these podcasts are so important. And, in years to come, they'll probably look back and be like, fuck, people were actually talking about this 5 years ago. They just didn't know about it. And I found that so much when you start researching this. It's like, even what libertarianism or what money is, and the connection between money and state, like, this is a discussion that's been going on for centuries. I just didn't know about it. And that's what's so fascinating about it. You start digging up some of these older writers and different theories. Like, okay, well, actually, this is something that really we've battled with as society for a long, long time. Before we go down that rabbit hole, though, because that's a whole nother direction, I'd love to focus back at something that you mentioned at the start. So you mentioned 2 forums that you were managing, a psychedelics forum and a second one. I didn't quite catch what it was, but what took you to that
It was
space?
just two places on this. It was just 2 places on the same forum. It's just the same.
And so what took you to psychedelics? Why was that such a part of your life?
Well, that forum, actually, I had been a part of for many, many years. And I had originally gone there because I had spent some time learning how to grow mushrooms with Paul Stamets out on his farm in the late 90s. He used to do classes out there. So I was actually able to go out to his farm and like kind of study with him on his actual property with his labs and all that, and do all these neat, really cool mushroom culture things, because he's actually almost like a genius level mycologist that's doing all kinds of interesting things with patents and the metabolites, and really nothing to do with psychedelics, but just very like mushroomy science. So I think like that exposure was very important. But even by the time I had gone to study with him, it was a very conscious decision. And he even said like if you are doing anything with psychedelics, I don't want to hear about it, I don't want to know about it. So it's like, it was kind of like one of those unspoken things. But I had worked with LSD for many years, and it had become like a pretty deep part of my life from, I'd say, the early 90s on. And so I think in the late 90s, I started becoming interested in taking more control over the process, learning more about the chemistry and actually how things were happening and where this stuff comes from and what the patents say. And it actually looked relatively involved. And even though it was the 90s, like a lot of the things were still kind of heavily watched as far as chemicals, and doing your own synthesis was just a little out of the reach of teenage me. So it was like, what's the next step here? And so I was like, okay, maybe you could like grow mushrooms. Maybe that's something that you could do. Because I lived in an area where people could actually harvest them, but it was just very like, or pick them naturally, but it was just very like willy-nilly, and it wasn't very like sure thing type deal. So I just like the idea of kind of bringing the process into in-house in essence. So then you don't have to worry about things like quality or where it comes from, or is this good? Is this the right thing? And, or any of that stuff. So I think I was very interested in all that. And that took me down the path of learning mushrooms. And then I actually ended up running a little mushroom farm in the city that I was in. It actually was like a zero waste farm where we taught people in the third world how to kind of grow food with basically zero input. So like if you are in a really super poor area, you can't go to the store and buy soil and fertilizers and things like that. You basically have to make do with what you got. So we had a demonstration farm that was about 20-30 acres, something like that had all kinds of different areas set up. And so I ran the mushroom part of that for many years. So that was all pretty formative. And that was kind of leading up. And while I was doing the mushroom farm, I actually had like posts on this psychedelic mushroom forum under the farm's name. And then I also had my little second persona that was like the psychedelic me. So then I don't know, I think I had just spent many years just in the community trying to there's like a sense of harm reduction, because misinformation in the psychedelic sphere is actually super toxic, in the sense that you could actually hurt people, and some cases you may even kill someone. So there was a very heavy harm reduction sense within the community. So I kind of fit well into that, which I kind of resonate within the Bitcoin community. I think it's like that anti-shitcoinery Bitcoin maximalist style of saying like like there's a true path here that's actually good, wholesome, and healthy, and then there's other paths that are going to lead you to get wrecked and ruined. And we've all kind of walked these paths, and if you want to listen, cool. If not, you can go there yourself, but you'll probably find out just the same way we did. And I think like that mentality is very positive. So I think in those years, like forums were very powerful for me. They were a very direct way to kind of have like a global tribe. It was the beginnings of the internet. It was kind of pre-social networking and stuff like that. So these internet forums that would pop up would be how I don't know if it was Terrence McKenna or Tim Leary who said find the others. So like, how can you find the others, the people who think like you and the people who are going to kind of support what you're doing and kind of nurture that vision and passion and help you grow with this, you know, vision of yourself. Like, how do you find these others? So these forums were one of the methods that I used to kind of find the others. And, you know, here I was kind of using it as a testing ground. And like, you know, you kind of go here, you forge your ideas, you battle it out with people, see what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And, you know, I think like that kind of helped me create like some kind of internet philosophy of just, you know, how does this all work? What's our place in it? And how does this stuff all play out? And I think I'm still kind of working on how all that stuff fits together.
What I love hearing about that though is, and this is often the way, that people have a certain lens on the world due to the experiences that they've had. And what you've just described and that kind of corollary to Bitcoin maximalism is interesting, right? Because you're like, I've been here before. And it was, you know, became clear to you that you could leverage some previous experience basically. And I love learning about that, because having conviction in Bitcoin is, for me, driven by, you know, all and above everything else, people. And I'm like, okay, this person believes in it, this person believes in it, this person believes in it. And they've all got different skill sets and different journeys, and they're all believing in it. You know, that's what I look at for like, how do I gain deep conviction? Now, the closer I get to it, the more I actually learn about how it functions and why it's important. But initially, it's just like, I need to see a bunch of other people that I can trust and also have got a really good reason for believing in it. And boom, that's good enough for me to at least start putting an allocation in my portfolio. It's got bigger and bigger over time, which I think is often the way with people who get into Bitcoin. They're like, I'm not early enough and I don't have enough. You know, that's the same two things that every Bitcoiner kind of feels. But how interesting. Okay. And so for someone like myself that knows very little about mushrooms in the psychedelic space, you guys were farming them, you were teaching other people to grow them. You were doing this for purely medicinal purposes, or, you know, for me, LSD was like, you know, in a field as a 19-year-old getting shit-faced with my friends and trying some acid. That was purely like a kind of, well, obviously we were looking to experience a different vision on the world per se, but it wasn't for a, you know, I've got heart disease and I need to take mushrooms. Talk to me about a bit more why it's important to learn about mushrooms, and what are some of the benefits of doing that?
So there's like multiple layers to this. There are like legit medicinal qualities to psychedelics. Like things like cluster headaches have had a lot of like interesting research with the way that they actually can for the people that experience them, they're like totally debilitating, mess you up. And small amounts of psychedelics have been shown to either alleviate them for many, many months at a time, which is significant when you're experiencing these debilitating headaches almost daily. So there's medicinal aspects of it, but that wasn't really what I was into. I was more into like the revolutionary self-sovereign nature of these technologies and how they help you look into yourself and find really like what it is to be human. You know, I think these things help us look into ourselves and really like all we have is our perception of the world and our understanding of the world. So this helps you kind of take a look at yourself and shift that perspective in a way that is unusual to you. And by having this perspective shift, you gain additional insights, I think. I actually wrote a whole article on it. It's kind of like Citadel 21 told me it was one of the longest articles they've ever published. And it was all about using psychedelics and Bitcoin as self-sovereign tools. So these are things that you can use to better your life, that are wholesome, healthy, and they actually help you to learn new things just by using them. However, you actually have to use them in order to get the benefits from it. It's not something you could just read about or think about or ponder about and actually get the benefits. You have to actually go in and use these technologies to leverage the benefits that you might possibly get from them. So I've spent a lot of years really like deeply investigating psychedelics as a technology on many different levels. So I've looked into the medicinal things. I've looked into all that, but I just think really what it comes down to is each person has to like look into themselves and see if that's interesting to them or not to investigate this stuff. But to me, it's basically just I, I don't know how to describe it, but I think it's probably one of the more important things to me is the experiences I've been able to leverage through some weird molecules, and I find that to be an interesting thing. And I find other people are able to translate similar experiences into real world physical manifestations of this creativity. So that's another part of my article that I wrote, is like how people are taking these psychedelics and actually using them to solve real world problems that you can measure and equate and actually say like, hey, before we didn't have this patent, you did this, now you wrote this, and now we have this. So it's actually a measurable result. And we had a lot of science on that was starting in the 60s, and a lot of it got abandoned, shut down, and kind of disregarded for almost 40 years. And now we're starting to see a whole new renaissance of it. And the psychedelic renaissance that's happening now has multiple layers, and we're also seeing what I would consider shitcoinery, in that realm as well. So you have a whole bunch of people trying to shill psychedelic stocks and things like that, where how are these incentives aligned? And I think anywhere where there's something pure and good, there's going to be people that come in and try to take advantage. So I think that we're seeing that in a big way in all these technological facets that we're seeing, both the psychedelics and the cryptography.
And that's very cool, this concept of revolutionary self-sovereign technology. And that's a phrase, frankly, that until I started digging into Bitcoin, I'd never heard of before. And you start to read things like the sovereign individual, and it's like, wow, this is incredibly powerful concept that it's clearly happening as we speak. And it just sparks the imagination. You start thinking differently. What intrigues me about what you're saying is not something I've come across before, but I like the idea of using mushrooms as a form of medicine. And that, in a sense, is a self-sovereign technology, because you can just grow them. You don't need a patent from a pharmaceutical company to save you from your life-threatening illness. You just need to grow them in your backyard, and you can make yourself better. That to me really resonates as a self-sovereign technology. But what you're saying is there's actually not just a physical side of it, there's then a psychological side of it. And that's not something I've considered before. So after an experience of psychedelics, how does it make you feel? Like what does that actually kind of like, what can you try and explain that to me as someone who's not been through that experience?
Well, of course not.
The answer is no.
Yeah. It's like, it's just like Bitcoin. You got to use it to see how it works. So yeah, it's not something that I could probably explain to you, but I can tell you certain things. Like I can tell you that, for example, one of the most beneficial things to me is kind of that I can generate new thought patterns or new ideas. So if I'm thinking about a specific problem, or I had a project that I was working on and I needed to kind of see the way that certain gears would move together in a mechanism so that it would perform like this basically like a beautiful movement that I wanted to create, but I just couldn't kind of get my head around it. So I was able to take psychedelics and I could actually visualize it, and actually visualize it in multiple ways. And I didn't just get one idea for how this could come together. I actually had multiple ideas for how it could come together, and like fully functioning moving parts. And I was able to like kind of zoom around them in different ways and kind of look at it from different angles, just because I was able to think about it now in a different way than I was able to, 20 minutes before, or half an hour before, the day before, just by introducing this new software that I'm running on my operating system. Basically, it's just like I've upgraded the operating system by running some new software on it, and now I'm able to access new tools and functionality that before I couldn't do because I wasn't running that software, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. So the psychedelic acts as the software layer on the hardware that is our body, essentially.
Absolutely. But I also think there's some sense of like these things aren't user friendly in some ways. Like Bitcoin and psychedelics aren't exactly like user friendly technologies. There's stuff that you kind of have to study and use over time and kind of learn how they work with you. It's not usually something that you become extremely expert just by using it one time. A lot of these things, like, they take some investigation and some like with psychedelics, I like to say, you know, for people, it's like if you just have one hit of LSD, it's kind of like a roulette, you know, like you never know how it's going to go. It's like, could be good,
Yep.
could be bad. It could be a really strong amount that's on that tab, or it could be almost nothing and you don't feel it. It's just like, you don't really know
Yeah.
what the heck you have there. So one of the
Lucky
ways you can
dip.
leverage that, exactly, you're just kind of hoping for the best. So one of the ways to leverage that is if you grow mushrooms, like you can have like a decent amount of them. And the weird thing about mushrooms is, again, like one mushroom might be much more potent than the one next to it. So like you kind of never know what you're going to get. But if you just dry them and powder them, now you have a homogeneous mixture that's actually a standardized dosage. And you can kind of begin to learn with this because you have enough sitting there to you say, I'm going to start with an amount that's actually not going to really affect me very much, maybe like half a dose or a quarter of a dose of what I think, you know, may actually affect me. And you kind of work your way up from there. You don't like put a lot of expectations into the first few doses because you know you're kind of just getting your feet wet, but you're kind of getting an understanding of how this affects you, what amount of this does X amount to you, and you kind of become a little more familiar with it. So that as you work your way up to a full dose, it's still, there's a threshold at which you will cross, which things will become weird, and you'll like, you know, you'll experience the fullness of what it is to go through the experience, and that's a good thing. But you've actually worked your way into a place where you actually know what you're using is good. It's not poisonous. It didn't come from some dude named Todd off the street that you just met or off the internet. And like, you know, it's not some weird poison. You know, you have all these factors that are working in that. Even if you have the best LSD in the world, if you're unsure of these weird factors that you just don't know, you could just work yourself into a weird thought loop and get yourself worried that, oh, I took poison, but you're actually on the best stuff in the world, and get yourself all worried about stuff. So it's the same thing with Bitcoin. If you send a transaction and you just like, oops, that was like not to the right address or something like that, that's, there's kind of no take backs there, you know, like a lot of these things are very final actions. So you have to like think through these things before you take your action because they have consequences. But if you do them right, then again, you can leverage these amazing benefits. It's like I can teleport value from here across anywhere in the whole world in basically 10 minutes. I can perform this magic if I do it right, or I could totally screw it up and like burn the Bitcoin by sending it to a bad address.
That's cool, isn't it? So the provenance of your mushroom is, you know, you've nurtured this thing from start to finish, all the way to like when you ingest it, essentially. And you can either just pick it straight out of the ground, have a crack, and you don't know what necessarily the strength or dosage will be. But equally, then by refining it through a process that you completely control, then you've had to learn that process. But the result of doing that is great benefit. And I know the feeling, you know, when you send a piece of Bitcoin somewhere and it just doesn't arrive in the address you thought it was going to, and your heart drops and your stomach starts fizzing and you're like, oh fuck, did I send it the wrong place? I sent it the wrong place. More often than not, it's been a physical human within an exchange that for some reason hadn't clicked go, and therefore what I was doing didn't work as it was supposed to.
Sure.
But it's still that feeling of like, oh shit, I've sent something somewhere and I've got this wrong. Whereas like the banking system that we're kind of like lured into in so many ways, oh, take out a credit card or come and get debt from us and we'll make it easy for you. It's irresponsible in so many ways, and it doesn't incentivize you to take responsibility. And that's kind of like the self-sovereign vibe. It's like, take responsibility for yourself. Your health is only your choice. Work out how to be healthier, or your wealth, how to save properly, or all these other different factors that kind of come into the conversation and make us who we are. But equally, there's all these different incentives around us that we have to kind of, much like the shitcoin space, go, that actually doesn't make sense, or that doesn't make sense. Gosh, fascinating. Okay, I'd not thought about it like this before. How cool. Okay. And I'd like to cycle back a bit. And you were talking about being an artist, and we haven't really touched on that yet. But the phrase you used was, you like to use art to spread a message. That really kind of sprung out at me. So perhaps you can teach me a bit about what your artistic, I don't want to use the word career, it's a bit of a shit word, but like, have you always been an artist? What drew you into, you know, being creative, and what does it mean to spread a message with art?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd love to talk about all that. I've been doing art since as long as I can remember. I remember my parents sending me to like a painting class at some place when, you know, I must have been in kindergarten or something like that. And I painted what I thought was like a super cool thing. The guy taught me how to paint bushes and the sky. And what he told me was, you think of the sky as blue, but it's actually not blue. It changes, and you can actually mimic this with the paint by adding white into your blue as you go down. So at the top, we're going to start with a dark blue, and we're going to kind of add white and come down. And then, here's how we're going to do the bushes. You just basically put this darker green, and then we're going to put some lighter green on top of that. And so little kindergarten me was just like, holy shit, I just painted the sky and this bush, and it's like right here in front of me, and now it's on the page. So I think it was one of the first times of translating, something from the world into your mind and then back into a physical object that really kind of struck. And at some point, I think in the 90s, I was making these little art things for people and giving them to, as Christmas gifts, because I collected a LSD blotter. It's actually the LSD artwork with no LSD on. It's just perforated paper that has designs on it. And I would kind of break them into little strips. They come into blocks of 900. So I would break them into little things of 100, put them on a little dollar store frame with some background on it, and give it to my friends as like Christmas gifts. And some of them still have it to this day, like 30 years later. And somebody told me, oh man, you should sell these things. And I was like, yeah, I think so. And they're like, yeah, man. I was like, okay, cool. So then the next time, it wasn't a Grateful Dead, but some music group came to town. We just set up outside the venue and put a little blanket on the floor, and I put all my little dollar store things up with my little artwork, and we sold out at the show. And I was like, holy shit, this is crazy.
Wow.
And people actually, it was a very rewarding experience, because I got to interact with all these people that I didn't know. They were kind of supporting my vision, and it's like, hey, like, this is a cool thing, keep doing this. And I was getting a lot of like really positive vibes and just things that I had never experienced before. So that was a really cool and really foundational experience for me in just kind of building this out. And so over the years, we went from throwing a blanket on the floor in the parking lot to actually like paying for vending spaces. One of the first guys that gave me spaces was at like a really cool psychedelic art gallery here. They do an annual show for Art Basel, and they let me put my stuff up there. And that was like the first time I had ever paid to vend, and I was like kind of nervous about how this is going to go. And yeah, just like, and then eventually we were doing these big shows and kind of traveling around the country, setting up these really cool like temple structures and music festivals. And it got really like interesting with just kind of moving this vision out there. But all the art was kind of super focused on like psychedelics, LSD, and mushrooms specifically as basically wholesome, good, something that's like positive for society, just something that they're tools that we haven't quite figured out yet. So pretty much all the art would encode different information about that. So I have my Bitcoin full node sculpture that everybody kind of knows about now, but before that, I was doing different psychedelic mandalas. Like I have a DMT mandala that actually shows the tree that it's grown from, and little shamans harvesting the roots and how they have to go through the entire process of extracting the root bark and actually turning it into crystallized DMT. And so I have the whole entire process kind of encoded within a mandala. So it's basically glyphical information, just how the Egyptians did with the hieroglyphs, or the Mayans did with their language. Is basically a very specific story that's being told. But if you're not kind of keyed in, you just look at it and you just think it's just a picture or a motif or a design, and you keep on going with your day. But there's actually some very deep knowledge that's encoded within here. So in addition to the DMT mandala, I actually have an LSD mandala where it has 4 rings. Each of the 4 rings is kind of divided up into different numbers of stones, and the numbers of stones are related to the numbers of atoms in the molecule. So you have four atoms. You have carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, and each of the rings is basically divided out into the number of each atom. And the center ring actually has a recipe that if you follow, you end up making 31,000 doses of very high quality LSD. So I definitely try to encode some information in the art. So when I came to Bitcoin, I basically just translated that same thing into like, how is Bitcoin made? And that was kind of where I came up with the full node sculpture.
Awesome.
Kind of riffing on this encoding of information.
That kind of, and that I go back to that whole, everyone has a lens that they brings to Bitcoin. That is a brilliant backstory as to why you created your Bitcoin full node and where the inspiration for it came from. In that you had a toolkit that already existed, which was spreading the message about mushrooms and LSD using art that people were already enjoying. You'd grown it from a as you mentioned, a blanket outside a festival to actually, full stages at stuff. I imagine you were creating. So, and it's a very entrepreneurial journey, oh, that worked. Okay. And there was probably a number of other things you tried, but they didn't really work. So you followed the one that worked. And then that snowballs into
Yes.
more and more and more and more. And that's just that whole creative process of just throwing shit at the wall. Like something cool's going to come out of this process. And what people enjoy, you can't predict. But unless you create something in the first place, then you're never going to find out. And it's that whole
Yeah,
like
there's a very
making
real world
failure,
feedback.
making
I'm
failure
sorry.
your friend. And today we use social media instead. Like the 90s would be much more of a physical process as an entrepreneur. Like the internet's really changed how things work. And here am I in Melbourne talking to you on the other side of the world with then an audience that's dotted all over the place using digital tools that are all saying to me, Jake, we like what you're doing with your podcast, carry on. And it's kind of the same
Absolutely.
thing in a strange way. God, how cool. And so what was it about Bitcoin then that you were like, this is a message that has to be put out there? So I can see the journey you've been on to create your artwork prior, but how did you kind of start studying Bitcoin? And your art piece, the full node, is incredibly detailed, and that would have required a lot of study to kind of get your head around how it actually functions. How was that process? And you used I noticed from your article I was reading yesterday, so it's modeled after the ancient navigation tool, the astrolabe, and it acts as a compass for a humble Bitcoiner. So, what's the history of the astrolabe, and how did that kind of become part of the process? I'm really intrigued, and for those that are listening, you need to go and check out Fractal Encrypt's artwork. Like it's impossible to kind of describe in words without actually seeing it in videos, etc. But go check it out. So what's an astrolabe, and why were you so driven to start telling the story that is Bitcoin?
Okay, I'm glad you kind of brought those all together, because I was going to riff on the astrolabe thing, but I think like how the telling the story is also an important part. But what an astrolabe is, it's an ancient navigational tool, and these originated pretty much in around like 800-ish AD to 1100 AD. There was like in the Persia area, Islamic mathematicians were doing this amazing celestial things, and basically figuring out through a lot of it was religious related. So they wanted to find out which way was Mecca, or which way the stars were going for certain religious reasons. So they would become very expert at tracking them. And they found I think there was at first like 13, and right now it's 57 celestial bodies that we use to track navigation. And so they would plot these in these extremely artistic, beautiful, amazing instruments called astrolabes. And these are just master craftsmanship. If you look up like these ancient astrolabes, it's just mind-boggling how these things, first of all, were even made, but second of all, just how to use them is almost lost to time. Like the astrolabe is one of those things I tell people you can learn almost anything on the internet, but the astrolabe was one of those things that I ran into that I was not able to learn as much as I would like on the internet. And I've actually had to buy a lot of physical books and things like that actually have plates showing, photographs from collections of these things, and actually analysis of how they were put together and things like that. And actually, a guy wrote a book that I've been reading just the past few months, and it's extremely amazing book. And it was like $80 on Amazon, and I was like a little hesitant to buy it. I was like, I don't know, but it was truly it's truly full of things that I've never seen on the internet, and it's just extremely powerful. And you can make these devices today, and you can actually use them to navigate, and you can kind of make them for your hemisphere. So wherever you specifically are in the world, the astrolabe would kind of be specific to your location. So depending on where you are in the world, you can use different plates on these astrolabes, and then they have multiple layers, and you can kind of spin one layer over the other, and they line up with these amazing marks and geometries. And it's just a really artful way of basically creating a precision mathematical tool that gives you absolute definite information. So that just seemed very close to Bitcoin to me in many ways. It's like a tool that you can use to navigate, not only like financial spaces, but just so many different spaces in the world. And a lot of those are kind of marked out in the Bitcoin full node sculpture. I have a whole ring that's called the Merkle tree ring. It has 21 trees that have each different point. It's kind of divided up into 3 sections: a sociological section that kind of goes through the, the people stuff of Bitcoin, so the community, the politics, things like that. And then there's a technological section that's 7 things that are basically like, how does Bitcoin work? So proof of work, Merkle trees, ECDSA, SHA-256, things like that, that are more like under the hood, mechanical, technological facets. And then there's a financial pillar as well. So you have these 3 things that all kind of work together. Like, what are the things that make something money? So it goes through the portability, divisibility, and kind of ties all these things together. And it just shows how Bitcoin is super multidisciplinary in the sense that you kind of need to come from a lot of angles and understand a lot of different things to even have a hope of understanding some small portion of Bitcoin. But the rabbit hole is kind of never ending. So it's always like there's always deeper to go. And I find that that's something that's, both empowering and interesting, because you don't want to get bored by kind of like, hey, I've hit the end of this game. It's like done now. You kind of never run into that issue. So there's so much more with astrolabes. I just love them so much. I definitely recommend, if anybody's interested in like interesting astronomical or navigational instruments, you should just quickly Google some astrolabes. They're just super cool. But now I can kind of talk about what you were asking in terms of why did I think this is an important story to tell. And I think in many ways, like, Bitcoin's been empowering for me in my life. And I think like through the art specifically, and I feel like I kind of got lost in my head there.
No, that's
but
okay. So just to highlight where I was going with that. So the point being is that you had a love of astrolabes. You had a history of building artwork for like psychedelic and mushroom messaging. And what I'm trying to draw out is like, what was it that drove you to do the same thing for Bitcoin? And you just mentioned already, like, Bitcoin's already helped you in your life. So just riff from there, basically. Like, there must have been a moment in your day or something. You're like, do you know what? Fuck it. I'm going to create something for Bitcoin. And that would have begun the process. And that's really what I want to try and draw out.
Oh, well, there was definitely a moment where I was like, I'm going to do this specific project. And it was actually at a San Francisco Bitcoin conference. And it was actually like LSD that brought me there, that, I was like,
No way.
had basically spent the entire day kind of watching these talks and conferences and taking in all this content. And, had taken like a small amount of LSD. I even went to a Bitcoin developer conference in the evening, or a meetup in the evening. And I just remember coming home, and I think someone during the day, one of the talks, had talked about the clock and calendar like nature of Bitcoin. And I had really spent a long time in the day thinking about it. When I got back to the hotel room at night, my sketchbook, I started like working. So that was really like, that was like July 2019. And it took me about 6 months to get to the point where I actually had a design, like, okay, I know what this thing kind of looks like. It wasn't I didn't do any like laser cutting of anything at that point. It was more just the schematic. And so it took me about a good 6 months to get there, and maybe another month or so to actually cut the pieces and lay them out, so I kind of saw what it would look like physically. So that was all certainly like a very definite progression of things. And the reason that I kind of wanted to go this way was just that I saw a lot of similarities in Bitcoin, and I also saw it was just so elegant and beautiful that there was a lot of things that could be lined up. And in the process of actually making the sculpture, a lot of times I think if you have to teach something, you want to learn it better so that you can teach it better. So I spent a lot of time digging in deeper and actually getting in deeper. And I like basically spent a lot of time just by myself, kind of like staying away from friends and internet and all kinds of other like distractions that I could, just kind of like working on art, trying to learn how this stuff works, and trying to put something together, and the hell with everything else. And eventually I pop my head out of the lab and say, okay, this is what I've been working on. But until I actually had kind of put some of this together, I think I didn't actually realize like how much I would learn from mapping it out in 2D. So there's a lot of information that you get from text or numbers just by themselves. But when you start arranging them geometrically, like in a map of some kind, which the full node sculpture schematic is totally like a map of Bitcoin over 132 years. So it maps out the entire thing with block heights and the whole thing. And you see how like elegantly it all kind of flows together. And a lot of that wasn't me. That's just Bitcoin. But I didn't realize how it actually had these like harmonics that are actually happening at different layers. But when you see the sculpture, it's easy to explain because you can kind of point things out and say, oh, hey, this is how these things flow together and this is how this works. And even the very, very center, which is the part that's really super highly based on the astrolabe, like not exactly stolen from the the people in the 800s, but kind of like it's deeply inspired. Like even that area was like extremely enlightening, because as I just mapped out the issuances, I realized that we have almost like these little eras that happen. So with the block rewards, you have a what I call the double digit era, single digit era, and then the sub Bitcoin era. And this is something that I just totally discovered by doing that little astrolabe thing. And that's the first reward cycle. We have double digit rewards. So 50 Bitcoin per block, 25 Bitcoin per block, and 12.5 Bitcoin per block. So those are all your double digit numbers. Yep. That's the first three reward cycles. Then the next section of 3 reward cycles is the single digit reward era. So we haven't hit that yet, but it's going to be three Bitcoin per block, 1.5 Bitcoin per block, or yeah.
I get your point. Yeah.
Anyways, yeah. So, and then like after that, everything is sub Bitcoin. So now we're not even getting a whole Bitcoin per block every reward. So there's 28 of those eras that are actually less than 1 Bitcoin per block. So, and that's most of all of the history, all of the future of Bitcoin is going to be sub Bitcoin block rewards. So it, that was one thing that kind of shows you. And there's other things in there that really showed me like, hey, the earlier you get in on this stuff and the earlier you understand this stuff, the more opportunity you have to get a higher stake in it, because the longer you wait, the less Bitcoin is going to become available. So it's a very graphical, visual way to display that. And for me, I learn things graphically and visually. So it's a learning thing for me too, to make this stuff. And I think like one of the main driving forces for me to make any art is just, it's something that I think should be in the world, but it doesn't currently exist. So it's kind of my responsibility to bring it there, and no one else is going to do it.
And because I was going to say about that, the style of learning. So I consider myself a good learner across different formats, but as soon as I started reading the Bitcoin Magazine article of yours that I dug up on your Twitter yesterday and started looking at the design of your Bitcoin full node, it was another form of learning that I just hadn't come across in the rabbit hole so far. And that was purely just because of the visual side of it. It's like, oh, fuck me, that's how it kind of all fits in together, but at scale. And so, on a day-to-day basis, the price is up, the price is down, this government's banning it, Bitcoin mining's fucked. All of these kind of different things that batter you on a day-to-day basis, they're just noise. Like, all you got to do is look at your Bitcoin full node and see, well, this is the issuance schedule, and it is guaranteed to get, less and less and less and less over time. So obviously it's an accumulation game, and it's just, you got to just relax basically and take a big breath and say, okay, if this plays out, which you can be confident that it does based on all the research you've done, this is all you really need to know. Everything else is noise, because people will figure out those problems as they crop up. And that to me was really powerful. So it was another tool basically to help understand what Bitcoin is. And it draws to mind, I had Brandon Quittem on. He wrote that wonderful article about the mycelium of Bitcoin and mycelium, the comparison between them, this idea of decentralized networks. And that was his unique view on the world reapplied to Bitcoin. And it really helped me understand Bitcoin for what it is. And this is just another one of those examples where your artwork is helping me understand Bitcoin for what it actually is. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful. So thank you. And it's really cool to dig into the details of the creative process that brought that. That's the conclusion. Well, how did you get there? And that's what I always find so interesting. And it's awesome. Well done. I'm sure that the feedback you've received is, through the roof, and much more so than you ever imagined. What I'd like to dig into a little bit is this process of getting some creative space. So you kind of knew you were going to create something. You had this idea, you'd been cruising around San Fran. You're like, fuck it, I'm going to do this. And you then had to like kind of draw yourself away from the world and go through what is, I now lovingly call proof of work. Like, proof of work is all around us, and we value it all the time in different ways. And I just never even realized that was like a thing. And, once you go down the Austrian economics hole, you start to understand actually why that is the case. And that's really helpful lens as well. But what did it feel like? You're like, okay, I know I'm going to do this thing, and I know that I can't listen to anyone else whilst I kind of get most of it done. Teach me a bit about that period of your life.
Well, there's so many layers to that because, I had, I think there was like a lot of fear because now looking back, you say, okay, the sculpture was a success, people liked it. But at that time, there was no assurances of that. It was actually like, you know, like up until that point, it's earlier in 2019, 2018, I had been doing like a lot of these NFTs, and the market for that is very much like almost like every weekend I was able to just make some weird stupid thing and like some graphics program and post it, and people would buy it for like, it wasn't a huge amount, but they would like buy it, and it kind of incentivizes you to make this cheap crappy work over and over and over again. So I was caught into these cycles. But like, I didn't just make the NFTs, I also like was somewhat technical, so I started looking into the I wanted to like write the smart contracts that actually issue the NFTs. And the more I looked into it, the more I didn't like what I was seeing. There was things like pause features in these contracts. And, I just realized I didn't actually have control over these things that were supposed to be tokens that I had sovereign control over. It was all like this lie. So I was kind of going through a lot of things, like both mentally, emotionally, and like artistically, like trying to find my place in this. But the fact of the matter is like at that time, late 2019, I had basically made this decision that like, fuck Ethereum, fuck all this other stuff. I'm like not doing none of this. Like I'm just Bitcoin only. But it was one of those decisions that once I made it, like the NFT stuff really started to pop off. And so all my like in quotes, like friends that I was making art with over this time, like started selling stuff at like much more expensive. And so it was like, am I doing the right thing here, working on a physical piece of art when like all this other activity is actually happening? Like the market seems to want this. Am I like making the right decision here? I'm kind of doing the opposite of what the market is telling me to do. But at the same time, it was extremely gratifying because now I'm actually working on something that was like a much more intensive, a much more deep project. It wasn't some weekend throwaway project. It was actually something that was like deeply like and there things fit, and so like how does this all work together? And so it was both extremely gratifying and rewarding to create it,
Sorry, I'm
but
going to
at the
have to
same
jump
time
in.
extremely scary and unsure. Yeah.
The internet went dodgy for a second. Can we just rewind to your
Yeah,
story by about 30 seconds? So you were talking about
sure.
the incentive was to kind of basically go and create NFTs that were absolutely flying, and you had all of this self-doubt about, am I right to focus on creating some physical art? But once you decided to do it, you felt happier about focusing on something that was deeper with more purpose. That's where you'd got to, and it cut off. Sorry. So can you just go back to that point and carry on?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, I had basically come from a place where the market was telling me one thing, you want to make this cheap, crappy art and keep doing it over and over again, to my heart telling me this is just all scammy, weird shit coinery. And, like you need to kind of make a decision and find your way out of this. And the way I did that is through creativity and through art, through beauty, and trying to create something that was meaningful to me, something that was deep. And it was extremely gratifying to go through a process that actually had this proof of work, because it was a lot of nights of just looking at the screen, trying to move pixels around and see if anything was in here, if I was going to be able to pull this off, or if this design's ever going to come together. There was many months of just me playing, because a lot of this was designed both in Illustrator, which is a graphical program, but also Excel. So I'm using Excel and spreadsheets to kind of like do formulas and figure out how things work. And some of the stuff that we have, there's very clear information, and some stuff you have to really dig to pull it out. Like, so it was really interesting to find out how to research Bitcoin appropriately. And once the information that I was pulling at just made me more and more sure that I was kind of on the right path. So the process was certainly something that I think was very transformative for me. And it had all those aspects of great fear, great risk, great, intimidation, great self-doubt, but also great moments of creativity. And actually like, I think the creative process, while you're going through it, there's a lot of uncertainty because you don't actually, like, you have a vision in your head, but sometimes it's not fully formed. And I think this thing, like I said, it took me almost 6 months to get it into a place where I felt it was like fully formed. So the journey there tended to be very rocky, and certainly not something that, like I said, in hindsight, it seems like, oh, of course you would do that. But, during the time, it felt very much like, is this risk the right thing? Is this, am I doing something that matters here? Or is this just more stuff on the wrong path? So I think, like, now I'm happy to look back and say, I think I went the right way. But certainly during that period, it wasn't clear.
I love that concept of the market telling you one thing, but your heart telling you another. Shout out to Robert Breedlove, who came on the show and tells a great story of how his heart was leading him in a different direction to what the market was trying to get him to go in, essentially, where, he was being offered a high paying job to become the CEO of a business, and he decided to go in a different direction, start his own thing that ultimately took him down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And that's that process of following your heart. It's really, it's an emotional driven thing, and you're not quite sure what it means, but here we are, and talking about this wonderful piece of creativity that's concluded in your Bitcoin full node. It's fantastic to see the output of it. I'm conscious of time. I've got one more question that I want to ask before we wrap up. So the Wizard of Oz on my Twitter the other day, so I said you were joining me for a chat, and he says, as a question, what's the thing about Bitcoin that fascinates him that's yet to make it into his pieces, i.e. in relation to you? So what is it about Bitcoin that has yet to make it into your artwork, if there is one?
Oh, there's plenty about Bitcoin that hasn't made it into the artwork, and hopefully I'll get some semblance of all of it in before these people keep making new upgrades and stuff. But no, there's a lot in Bitcoin that I'm fascinated with that I haven't yet been able to do. And one of the things which I wanted to do on my, I don't know if you're familiar with the Bitcoin Infinity Key project that I had done a series of public keys, and each of these is a little physical key. And I did a Bitcoin transaction that actually had each of the keys had a public key address that was tied to the public key. So I did a single transaction that had 210 outputs in it. And what I would have liked to do, and basically each person that has a key, they have a private key and a public key, and that's their key. And what I would have liked to do is actually make a really cool multi-sig treasure hunt within those. So if you can maybe collect 20 of the keys, then you could spend money that's in the addresses for all 210 of them. But because at the time you can only put 20 keys in a multi-sig address, I wasn't able to realize it. But now with Taproot, we could do extremely large multi-sigs. We actually had the multi-sig that broke LND the other day, and that was a 998 of 999 multi-sig. So the fact that they could do that means that I could now do my 210 multi-sig like no problem. I just need to teach myself the way to do the Taproot multi-sig versus regular multi-sig. So that's one thing that I'm excited to do. And I'm actually doing some comic books that I want to do a series of 210. So I may get to do this like quicker than I thought, which would be super cool. So I just have to really quickly learn how to do Taproot transactions. I asked on Twitter, nobody's trying to teach me yet. So if you're listening here and you know how to do cool multi-sig Taproot TapScript, hit me up. I'm ready to learn. So that's one thing that is sure to make it into a very soon piece. Would be a very interesting, cool TapScript multi-sig if I can pull that off. Definitely want to do that. And then the other thing that interests me about Bitcoin that I haven't done yet is the Bitcoin full node is basically a 2D mapping of all the numbers and geometry in Bitcoin. So it's basically a 2D map. Even though the sculpture is 3D, it's basically layers of 2D that I laser cut. But I'm going to have access to a CNC, which will let me do actually full 3D stuff rather than just do 2.5D. So I want to, I want to actually leverage the ability of the 3D machine that I can use to actually map, instead of map the geometry in 2D, to map it in 3D, because I think there's a lot more to learn. Just like I learned some really cool things by mapping it out in 2D, like I told you about the sub Bitcoin things and the different eras. I think there's a lot more to learn. So I just need to, and so that's another thing that I'm actually working on right now. I've been doing some, instead of working in 2D and Illustrator like I usually do, I've been teaching myself Fusion 3D, which is a 3D modeling software. So I've been doing a lot of interesting things within that's kind of mapping 3D geometry. And one of the first things I did was I learned how to build the pyramid. So I built the Giza pyramid and the the Chichen Itza pyramid from Mexico into scale sizes, and I built them entirely out of equations. So basically just using like math. And it was really cool. It's like, hey, I built the entire Egyptian pyramid, one person, all by myself. It's so easy to do when you're just moving moving pixels instead of atoms. So yeah, I think there's a lot of neat things to come out of just taking the information that we already have from Bitcoin and just kind of looking at it in a different way. So we have the same perspective shift that we talked about at the beginning of this episode with the psychedelics. We have this perspective shift with the Bitcoin art, geometry, the numbers. Actually, we're just going to go from 2D to 3D, and I think there's more stuff to learn there. And I'm already kind of working on some of this stuff. So, brilliant. Wizard, there you go.
No, well, shout out to the Wizard of Oz for his questions. They're always great. And no, it's what I'm really hearing is someone who's on top of their game. Like you feel like, I can feel like you're in a groove, and you're like, okay, you know, you've really made some great progress in recent years, and hit on some, you know, obviously the market is telling you this has gone really well, but it's about your headspace, and it's amazing where creativity comes from. And yeah, this could be a whole nother podcast, I'm sure.
No, I think this is good. I do want to riff on that for just a second, because that's one thing that Canute was kind of talking recently with me about, was saying like how Bitcoin kind of actualizes Bitcoiners, and it's kind of the killer app of Bitcoin is us. So, you know, he wrote his book, which was basically, you know, gave him, you know, all this access, all this abundance came out from the book, and I'm doing my art, and all this abundance is coming through the art, and people are doing like programming, and all this abundance is coming through their creative work. So it's almost like if you take your creative passion and you point it at Bitcoin, and you follow these market signals, you know, like follow like what people are supporting, and if that's in line with your heart, like you're gonna find like that your passion and your creativity may actually be a lifeline that can change your life and bring you to new things through using these sovereign technologies. So you use these technologies, you leverage them. And for me, my life's changed, and I do think like Bitcoin will actualize many creatives in many different, you know, realms. Like, and I just say like there's creatives in all realms. Like a mechanic can be an artist mechanic, you know, a chef can be an artist of a chef's. Like we all have these creativities, and if you point it at Bitcoin, I think you will be rewarded in interesting ways. So I did want to just say that happened for me, and I do see that this happens for other people. And I think maybe if people point their passions at Bitcoin, they'll have similar experiences, or at least that's my hope.
Fantastic. Well, what a way to end it. Fractal Encrypt, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I really appreciate it. Finally, where can people get in touch with you if they want to reach out and have a chat?
Oh, you can find me on Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Fractal Encrypt, and should be pretty easy to find there. I don't have any kind of other social media, so if you see me on other places, it's a scammer.
Be careful with scams. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, man. Thanks for having me. I had a great time.
My pleasure.